So, what if the most powerful act of redesign in American history wasn't a new law or a brilliant invention? What if it was a revolution planned and carried out by the very people who were supposed to have no power at all? Today, we're going to dig into how enslaved Americans didn't just escape a system, they strategically dismantled it from the inside out. This idea from designer Caroline Hill is, well, it's a game changer. If systems of oppression are intentionally designed, that means they're not inevitable. They're not just a fact of life. They are blueprints. And blueprints can be undesigned. They can be taken apart, and they can be rebuilt into something totally new, something better.
And that leads to this huge, fascinating question. We usually think of redesign when we're talking about technology or maybe city planning. But what if the most radical, groundbreaking redesign in this country's history wasn't drafted in some fancy office, but in the cotton fields of the antebellum South?
And this right here is the crucial point. The designers in this story weren't the politicians or the generals. No, they were the very people the system was built to crush. They saw the system for exactly what it was, and they decided to break it.
Okay, so to really appreciate their redesign, we first have to get our heads around the original design. See, the system of slavery wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. And when the Civil War finally exploded, its initial goals were also part of a deeply flawed but very intentional design.
At the very beginning, this was what the great historian W.E.B. Du Bois called a white man's war. The industrial North fought to keep its market together, the agrarian South fought to keep its property. But look at the fine print of this design. Both sides were operating on the shared, deeply racist assumption that the 4 million enslaved people were just passive objects, not people who could shape their own destiny. In the war's original blueprint, there were barely even a footnote.
To really grasp what was at stake, we're going to use a really powerful metaphor from Caroline Hill's work, this idea of an assault on the public body.
Think of it like this. We each have a private body. That's you, me, our individual selves, where we experience our own personal joy and pain. But together, we all form a public body, this interconnected web of society. Hill argues that systemic oppression like slavery isn't just a series of individual tragedies, it's a deep, tearing wound in that collective public body. And in 1860, this is the epicenter of that wound. Nearly 4 million private bodies, held in bondage, were the absolute physical and moral center of the conflict that was tearing the American public body apart. They weren't a footnote, they were the entire story. So how in the world do you heal a wound that deep? You don't just treat the symptoms, you have to redesign the whole system that caused it in the first place. And this brings us to what W.E.B. Du Bois called the single most revolutionary act of the war, the General Strike. Now, this was not some chaotic stampede for freedom. It was a conscious, strategic, and decentralized act of pure genius. As Du Bois lays it out, first, they assessed the system. They waited, looked, and listened. When they figured out the Union armies might not return them, they started step 2, a mass withdrawal of their labor. Then they offered a new allegiance to the Union, and in doing so, they fundamentally shifted the balance of the entire war. They were redesigning the conflict in real time.
And this just says it all, doesn't it? Du Bois is crystal clear. This wasn't just some contributing factor. The General Strike was the decisive action. The enslaved population, through their own collective power, broke the back of the Confederacy.
What Du Bois described all those years ago is a perfect historical example of what Caroline Hill now calls designing at the margins. It's this radical idea that the people who are closest to the problem, the ones most impacted by it, are the ones best equipped to design the solution. They didn't need a fancy degree. Their lived experience was their expertise. But hey, redesigning doesn't stop at just dismantling something, right? It's also about building what comes next. And in the chaos of the General Strike, we see these first courageous attempts to prototype a new, more equitable America. And you can literally see the cause and effect playing out here. In 1861, the Union was still trying to prop up the old system. But by 1862, the sheer number of people fleeing slavery forced a redesign. That whole contraband of war declaration, it wasn't some grand moral awakening. It was a practical response to a new reality that the enslaved people themselves had created. Their actions forced the Union's hand, step by step, all the way to the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. And out of that forced redesign came these incredible brand new prototypes of freedom. You had 200,000 black soldiers transforming the Union Army. You had refugee camps, which Du Bois describes in amazing detail, becoming these little laboratories for self-government and free labor. And you had these experiments in land ownership starting up, laying the groundwork for economic independence.
And these prototypes weren't just scraping by, they were thriving. Du Bois carefully documented their success, pointing out that as soon as they were given a chance, the formerly enslaved showed incredible skill and business sense, completely shattering the racist assumptions that the old system was built on.
And this brings us right back to where we started. The success of those historical prototypes sounds a lot like Caroline Hill's modern call to action, doesn't it? They were designing, right there in the mud and chaos of war, the very kind of healing, equitable spaces that Hill is pushing for today. They were trying to make the nation's founding promises actually mean something.
But that great redesign didn't just wrap up neatly in 1865. The project of building a truly equitable America is an ongoing process. You could say the design is still unfinished.
The tools change, for sure, but the design principles, they hold true. Enslaved people used the stars as their technology for liberation. Today, we use our phones and the internet to make injustice visible. Those refugee camps were early prototypes for the kinds of healing, inclusive spaces we're trying to build now. And their act of withdrawing labor is still a powerful lesson in how letting go of old power structures is the only way to design new, better systems.
And this is really the ultimate takeaway. Equity isn't a destination we just arrive at one day. It's an active, daily practice of designing and redesigning our relationships, our communities, our systems. It's a verb. It takes constant, conscious work.
The lesson of the General Strike is just so clear. The power to redesign our world often lies with those the world tries to silence. That legacy of courage, of brilliant, ingenious design, that's our inheritance now. The work continues, and so the final question isn't just for history. It's for you. How will you contribute?